I met Christine for the first time off a train with John Michell, come from London to the little town of Goring, which sounds a rather violent place to be, for a day to go and inspect a site that I had predicted, which John Michell needed to work on the geometric shape that surrounds White Leaf Oak near Malvern Hills. It was a big deal for a while, and this geographic shape flows round Britain and includes the Abbey at Stonehenge, and it includes places in Wales and very much known to Prince Charles as well. So White Leaf Oak is the place in Malvern Hills. So we met off the train, and my wife and I, we went for a walk to this place with John Michell. Now, a walk with John Michell is something to be savoured for the rest of your life, because you're a free spirit, and he walked fast. For a man of his age, he walked fast. And Christine and I had a chat, and I hadn't met Christine before, so obviously when that happens, you sort of press certain things and see if you win a prize, you know. And we got on fine. It was got a good talk. And John suddenly leaped on the path at one point, leaped into a load of brambles and pulled out a sign saying, "The Temple." Now, only John would do that. He had a fantastic capacity for perception. And of course, he and Christine worked on that book, and it worked very well. It set people off thinking about geometry on the landscape in a new way. And since then, we've been to France together, haven't we? Not personally, and you know, we went to a gig. I think Hugh Newman was there too. We went to Karnak. We spent a time at one summer solstice there. I thoroughly commend her to the house. Christine. You.
Okay, so this is going to be Introduction to the Work of John Michell. My first slide, which for some reason isn't appearing, was of two birds in flight of a type called snowy egrets. They were flying up and communicating with each other. And the point there was that John Michell, who never seemed to stop moving, was a great communicator. He was, to me, like Hermes, a winged messenger. He navigated between the worlds, ranging high and wide. In Western astrology, the sign of Aquarius corresponds to the element of air. John was born in the sign of Aquarius and had 5 planets in that sign. He was, yes, a quintuple Aquarius. Anyway, the picture you see here is John in the early 1990s. Before him are a few letters that he'd received on the day the photographer came by. John maintained a wide correspondence with friends and researchers. He answered letters very quickly, writing back in his elegant calligraphic handwriting, sometimes with little sketches or paintings. John was born in 1933 and lived to the age of 76. He must have written thousands of letters in the days before computers. Here's another portrait of John. The scarf flying in the breeze echoes a painting that we're going to see later on. John was educated at Eton and Cambridge. He qualified as a Russian interpreter and fell under the influence of the author Dostoevsky. He also qualified as a land surveyor, a job that he did very, very well, and tried his hand at the property business, a job that he did very badly. He lost a lot of his family fortune. He navigated the swinging 60s in London with charm and good looks, moving in the circles of the hippie aristocracy and the Colony Club of Soho. He painted, he took LSD, he began to smoke cannabis, a habit he continued daily for the rest of his life. He began to write in his mid-30s. Okay, here on this slide we see Charles Fort on the left, and on the right is Plato arguing with Aristotle. Plato is the one pointing upward. Charles Fort spent much of his life in libraries, collecting reports of strange events and phenomena, things like teleportation, poltergeists, and UFOs. In a piece for the Oldie, John Michell wrote, and I quote, "Having sifted out the moralizers, systematizers, and word quibblers, I'm left with two philosophers as guiding beacons and masters of soothsaying. One is old Plato, the purveyor of the universal tradition to the West, and the other is Charles Fort of the Bronx. Both were great poets and myth-makers. Their views of the nature of the world, existence, and reality were essentially the same, though arrived at from different directions. Neither one of them recommended any system of belief." End of quote. And here's a diagram to illustrate John's approach. If Plato represents the vertical pole, Fort is the horizontal. John acted as an oracular spirit, a diamond in the center, a spirit in the center. Fort rules the horizontal realm of nature. Nothing in our fluctuating world is permanently real. All explanationism will fail. The nearest thing to reality is the universe itself, a view like traditional mysticism. Plato is the pole of unchanging values, the pre-existent forms and numbers. These are angels or angles manifest in creation. Plato is the pole of idealism and orthodoxy. Upon it, John found peace and stability as well as refuge. When events on the horizontal became chaotic, he would scale the pole and survey from high above. Is it possible to maintain such contradictory views at the same time? John thrived on polarity and provocation. Like Fort, Charles Fort, he saw apparently separate phenomena as a chain of islands in a vast, irrational continuity. Fort and Plato finally are in accord on the oneness, the unity of being. Like Plato and Socrates, John was a revivalist or recollector of ancient knowledge. His work was to remember truth, in Greek, anamnesis, a word that means recollection. At his best, he was a messenger of the anima mundi, or William Blake's divine imagination. Many of his obituaries stereotyped John Michell as an old king of the hippies and an amusing English eccentric. Some went so far to say that he was a fine scholar. But he was, to me and to others, a diamond, a spirit in the Platonic sense, a spirit in the middle of the crossroads. He moved between Fort and Plato using many different conveyances and vehicles, images, themes, thoughts, and traditions, some of which I have listed here. He mixed these ingredients in different proportions in his different books. Most of the themes are already present in his first. So here's John at Stonehenge, rolling a spliff in front of the "No Smoking Beyond This Point" sign. Okay. Several people who have seen this photo interpret it to mean that John often broke rules or broke the rules when he thought they needed breaking. That's not exactly how I see it. I see it as John is lying half in and half out of the "No Smoking" sign. You really cannot pin the man down to one side or the other. John lived in a between world, a liminal space. He was a denizen of the threshold. These pictures show how John traveled. I took them one day when we were out somewhere in Kent, I think. Okay, someone had abandoned a sofa or a couch by the bus stop. John never planned a trip or worked out an itinerary or booked anything. He just hopped on the first bus or train going in the general direction of where he wanted to go and took his chances. Often he arrived at his destination much faster that way than by planning, finding comforts and unexpected pleasures along the way provided by the goddess of fortune. Here's John in a mellow mood, sitting in his typical position at Primrose Hill after a big Druid ceremony in 1992. This was a celebration to mark 200 years of the revival of Druidry by Iolo Morganwg. Around John's neck, you see a piece of mirror and stained glass work. The shape is a version of the New Jerusalem or Heavenly City diagram. This is the pattern of the dimensions of Stonehenge, those of the Heavenly City in St. John's description of Revelation, and those of Glastonbury Abbey, all connected with the dimensions of planet Earth and its relationship to the moon. John received this pattern as a channel, he said, in 1970. It was a driving force for his whole life's work. He painted and drew the New Jerusalem diagram countless times. Here's painted in a spectral sequence, almost as a rainbow of farewell. The seven-pointed star in the center, white on indigo, symbolizes the world's soul. This painting is on the front cover of his last book, How the World is Made, published posthumously. In his lifetime, John had many faults, but was also blessed with many gifts. Mental brilliance, artistic and literary talent, wit and humor, insight and perception. He harnessed these gifts with great energy and purpose, driven by the conviction, as I said, that he was the recipient of a divine revelation. John worked for decades at his best between midnight and 4 a.m. We will now take a look at the books that he's left us. This is his first book, The Flying Saucer Vision of 1967. In this book, he connected the writings of C.G. Jung with the phenomenon of flying saucers. John pointed out that many saucer sightings happen near places of ancient sanctity. This is the cover of a 1974 edition that really is vintage psychedelic art. John's introduction gives a feeling for how much criticism he had already received. Here I quote, "The author is still asked whether he believes in flying saucers, a question it needs steady nerves to deal with, and still replies that he believes in the phenomenon on the undeniable evidence of its effect. It now seems that Jung was right when in 1959 he identified the strange things seen in the sky as portents of long-lasting transformations of the collective psyche." End of quote. John goes on to say, the evidence for this is that throughout its post-war history, the flying saucer phenomenon and its literature have been associated with the change in prevailing modes of thought so radical that it amounts to a change in the popular cosmology. That is, in the way people understand the universe and their place in it. Changes in ways of thinking are illustrated here by upper right, the Glastonbury zodiac as perceived by Catherine Maltwood in 1929, lower right, and Alfred Watkins' ley or ley line. On the left, two examples of legendary dragon hills said to be the repositories of earth energies. John became interested in phenomena associated with straight lines through the work of Aimé Michel, who claimed that UFOs travel along particular straight paths. The View over Atlantis was published in 1969 and became a cult book here and abroad. Overnight, John became a sort of guru. The book contains much that is still current today. It has two main parts. The first is about landscape and alignments of prehistoric sites and natural landmarks. To the right, the cover art shows a landscape alignment or part of a ley. This is an original painting by the artist Una Woodruff, who produced a beautifully illustrated book called Inventorum Natura with an introduction by John. On the left, you see, with an old camera, Alfred Watkins of Hereford. He used the word lays to describe the alignments he first perceived in Britain in the 1920s. On the right, you see part of the St. Michael line of England, a source of inspiration to many researchers, including John. The second part of View over Atlantis is about the code of number underlying all ancient arts and sciences, especially connected with the dimensions of prehistoric temples and monuments. On the bottom is, again, the New Jerusalem or Heavenly City diagram as John inferred it from the layout of St. Mary's Chapel, Glastonbury. City of Revelation, the proportions and symbolic numbers of ancient cosmology, came out in 1971 and became another cult classic. This book and the View over Atlantis really form the two main pillars of John's vision. They established him as a leading scholar in ancient science and number symbolism. On the right is the revised edition, The Dimensions of Paradise. For the cover, John painted the Heavenly City diagram again. The silhouette of Stonehenge is on the far horizon, far left, just visible. The four rivers of paradise in sort of yellow gold flow outward. On the bottom, in pink, John has written the verse from the book of Revelation describing the tree of life that bore 12 manners of fruits. Quote, "And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of nations." Particular to the work of John Michell, as far as I'm aware, is his ability to visualize geometrically the stories, the narratives in ancient texts, such as passages of Plato and the Bible and others. His mathematical hermeneutics uncovers the inner meaning of the texts. He builds up his diagrams from a series of logical inferences, sometimes through the medium of gematria. That's a Kabbalistic system of equivalences between numbers and letters. The figure on the left represents the story of Simon Peter and the miraculous catch of 153 fishes from the last chapter of St. John's Gospel. And the figure on the right represents the world's soul, inferred from the text of Plato's Timaeus. The Old Stones of Land's End came out in 1974. This is a catalog of 44 stone monuments, megaliths, and crosses. In the egg-shaped graphic, you see that John dedicated it to the young Prince Charles as Duke of Cornwall, who had expressed interest in preserving the monuments. John also catalogs alignments or lays that these monuments mark. His aim was to provide a body of solid evidence for the existence of these alignments, very controversial among archaeologists, especially at that time. Here we make a short jump in chronology to 1977 to a short life at the Land's End. John had a very deep connection with Cornwall. This book is the story of the life of J.T. Blight from Penzance, an antiquarian illustrator born in 1835. He had a short and brilliant career before having a devastating nervous breakdown. He became an inmate of Bodmin Asylum. Officially, he died soon after. However, as John researched this book, he found that Blight had actually lived to a ripe old age, locked up for decades in the asylum. The book contains a portfolio of about 30 pages of Blight's drawings. 1975 saw the publication of The Earth Spirit, Its Ways, Shrines, and Mysteries in a highly illustrated series by Thames and Hudson. The cover shows the Serpent Mound of Ohio. In this book, John again refers to Plato. In the Laws, he speaks of the age of Cronus, when people lived as nomads, ruled directly by spirits and the gods. John writes that natural channels of energy flow between sacred places and the shrines and temples later built when people became sedentary. These channels are paths of psychic activity, apparitions, spirits of the dead, and fairies, in other words, Fortean phenomena. John suggests that the earth is a planetary being. Its essence is spiritual and interacts with the human spirit. The landscape in the background symbolizes the nomadic life and natural places of sanctity. These include caves, rocks, trees, springs, streams, rivers, hills, and mountains. Shamanistic paintings and pictographs sometimes enhance the sanctity of rocks, as in the lower left in Western Australia. On the upper right is the major oak of Sherwood Forest. This is an example of the development of a tree into a popular shrine in the 20th century. In the middle is a standing stone in Brittany, resorted to for fertility. Bottom right, a drawing by William Hogarth showing the founding of a Roman temple. Members of the priesthood stretched a line towards the heavenly body that corresponded to the tutelary god or goddess of the place. Feng Shui by Ernest Eitel appears in some bibliographies of John's books, but John was not actually its author. He championed the book and wrote an introduction to it. In the 19th century, Reverend Eitel of the London Missionary Society took advantage of his posting to China by studying Buddhism. He became the first European authority on Feng Shui. The 1973 edition helped to revive the subject and spread it to new generations of Westerners. Almost no one had heard of Feng Shui at that time. A Little History of Astro-archaeology came out in 1976. The new revised edition was retitled Secrets of the Stones. John preferred the term astro-archaeology to the more fashionable term archaeoastronomy because it gives the emphasis on archaeology. John says, "It is now clear that astronomy is but one aspect of a code of ancient science which was known to the megalith builders and to architects of temples throughout the ancient world. In their siting, orientations, and interrelationships, these structures are generally related to the pattern of the heavens, but they have many features that cannot be explained astronomically. The secrets lie not merely in the stars, but on the same ground which their builders trod." And on the top right, again, as we mentioned before, Iolo Morganic, the Welsh antiquarian and bard, connected with the celebration on Primrose Hill that we saw earlier. On the bottom right, Sir Norman Lockyer, who inspired astro-archaeology in the early 20th century. And on the left, Alexander Thom, who revived the subject in the 60s and 70s. John goes on to say, this restores to archaeologists the responsibility for investigating the ancient science, for recognizing and coordinating the many different approaches which are now being made to the subject. There are many deep secrets in the stones, but they have been long forgotten. They may not, however, be beyond recovery. John had the ability to take what might seem an inconsequential detail and develop it into a complete aesthetic and philosophical statement. A good example of this is his 1979 book, Natural Likeness, Faces and Figures in Nature, also published under the title Simulacra. People tend to see faces and figures in rocks, trees, clouds, and damp stains on walls. This human tendency reflects a corresponding tendency in nature to repeat certain basic designs. John passes in review the range of interpretations that scholars and observers of different ages have applied to nature's simulacra. These are always rooted in the dominant myth of their day. Attempts to investigate the mystery, says John, are subject to these words of Albert Einstein. It is the theory which decides what we can observe. On the far right is the silhouette of a remarkable head, the Sphinx Rock in the Lake District. Top left is another great rock head claimed by some as a monument of a lost culture in Peru. The fishtail on the bottom far left has apparently Arabic letters that spell a meaningful message. The middle column of pictures shows apparent faces in butterfly chrysalises. John illustrated this book with his personal collection of photographs. On the left is the Rough Guide to Unexplained Phenomena of 2007. This is a substantial introduction compilation of Forteana of all kinds. It's the latest edition of two earlier books that John co-authored with the well-known Fortean Bob Rickard. One is on the upper right, Living Wonders, published in 1982. The other is Phenomena from 1977, whose cover I cannot show you, unfortunately, because when I went to the British Library to find it, I found that 3 copies listed in their catalog were all missing. 2 of them are lost. Those are lost book slips on the right, and the 3rd copy is misplaced. It must be hiding somewhere in the basement somewhere. The librarians I spoke to had never heard of so many copies of a single book lost or missing from their collection. So I'll call it an unexplained phenomenon for the British Library. Here are a few examples of Forteana. Lower right is a drawing of Saint Joseph of Cupertino in levitation, of which there are many eyewitness accounts. On the top left is a depiction of a rain of blood falling in Lisbon in 1551. Bottom left is a garage manager in South Yorkshire whose garage was said to be haunted by ghosts of people killed in World War II. Customers often saw small coins being thrown unexplainedly. And on the top right is the Spider's Web crop circle of 1994. It occurred just outside the great earthwork of Faivre. Crop circles tend to occur in connection with ancient sites. Some crop circles are made by humans, and others do seem to qualify as Fortean phenomena. Ancient metrology, the dimensions of Stonehenge and of the whole world as therein symbolized, came out in 1981. Most of John Michell's books are not long. Few exceed 200 pages, and most are a good deal shorter. He laid his words down on paper only once. This is using an old typewriter, mind you, only once, and deliberately, with very few or no revisions. If I imagine John Michell as a sculptor, I see him as a stone carver rather than as a modeler, revealing shapes held within the stone with each stroke of his chisel. His style is nowhere more laconic than in this book. Only 48 pages of finely condensed research on ancient systems of measure, all based on geodesy, that is the dimensions of the earth. Here we see part of the code of metrology in 3 columns. The far left gives ancient units of measure. The middle column gives the values of the measures at 10 degrees north latitude. These are the tropical values. The third column gives the values of the measures at 50 degrees north latitude. These are the northern values. They all appear here in terms of English feet. John insisted that the English foot does not have 2 values because it comes from fractions of the equator. And this is a good place to highlight that many of John's books inspired other researchers to further his work, and in the case of metrology, most prominently by John Neal. The year 1982 saw the publication of Megalithomania. Hey, this is an account of the conflicting arguments about the meaning of the megaliths by antiquarians, archaeologists, and artists. The cover shows early investigations at Carnac in France. The word Megalithomania, of course, means popular enthusiasm for megalithic sites. A big wave of it came from the entry of astronomers into archaeology in the late 19th century. John held 18th century antiquarian William Stukeley in very high regard, and he wrote, "The genius of Stukeley has never been justly acknowledged. His wonderfully illustrated folio with engraved drawings of ancient monuments has never been surpassed." The following quote from Megalithomania gives an insight into John's way of thinking. Every culture is umbilically linked with its native countryside. The maintenance of those links is necessary for its survival, and as Stukeley perceived, it can only be renewed by strengthening them. For that purpose, Stukeley created a myth so well-founded that it has endured to this day, by which Stonehenge became a temple of the ancestral Druids and a prime symbol of national culture. His myth succeeded because it was in accordance with tradition on 2 levels, popular and poetic. Generations of academics since Stukeley have tried to stamp out the popular notion which associates megalithic monuments with Druids, but in vain. And on the literary level, Stukeley's picture of a magical civilization in far antiquity is in the same line of esoteric tradition which has always inspired poets despite the disapproval of their academic commentators. Eccentric Lives and Peculiar Notions came out in 1984. Here John gives the stories of 22 people whose beliefs went against those of their times. Although John was mining the vein of Fortean material, he intended this book for a wider audience. It was for a time a book club selection. The stories can be taken purely as entertainment. Some of the characters reappear in other books by John. For example, Delia Smith of Connecticut, who went mad attempting to open the tombs of Francis Bacon and Shakespeare. And she reappears in John's book, Who Wrote Shakespeare? In Eccentric Lives, John shows how people can go to great extremes because of their beliefs. On the upper left is a photo of Comyns Beaumont, a Fleet Street editor born in 1873. He produced a world history in which every famous event was located in the British Isles. His map shows how ancient Egypt and the Holy Land were in Somerset. On the right, you see Edward Leedskalnin of Latvia. Jilted by his teenage fiancée, he emigrated to Florida. There he built single-handedly and with simple tools a monumental castle made of coral rock, complete with stone beds and rocking chairs. The secret of how he manipulated the great stones disappeared with him in 1951. I think some people have tried to follow that up as well. John accepted a commission to write a guidebook to the sacred sites of England that came out in 1988. The map shows the locations of the sites that he treats, many of them in the southwest. The introductory chapter, The Making of a Sacred Landscape, summarizes the process of continuity and reformation at work in sacred places. In his chapter, Hints to Pilgrims, John quotes Major Wellesley Tudor Pole. He was the mystic and author who founded the Chalicewell Gardens in Glastonbury as a resting place for pilgrims. Tudor Pole says, whenever a center is found to be neglected or in disrepair, do not leave that spot without doing something, however small, to improve the situation in the spirit of loving service. Euphonics, a poet's dictionary of sounds, came out in 1988 as well. It contains delightful rhymes by John and illustrations by Merrily Harper, who's a writer and cartoonist. The book takes its departure from a dialogue of Plato called Cratylus. Socrates is judging in a debate about the significance of names. Are they chosen at random, or do they somehow match the objects that they designate? John's conclusion is that names are verbal imitations or sound pictures of the things they represent. And he considers euphonics required study for magicians, orators, lovers, and anyone who uses words for purposes of enchantment. Here's his rhyme for the letter L, lingering by a limpid lagoon. The L sound represents light and clarity. Its corresponding motion is of a languidly gliding liquid, as in a placid, limpid lagoon. I'm not sure I can say this one today. Anyway, John's rhyme, languid lovers lie in Lethe's valley, lethargic, lotus-like, they laze and dally. Idly the listless loafers, slaked with pleasure, slump on the lawns, recline and sleep at leisure. Stealthy oblivion lulls each slothful soul. The swelling floods glide in and o'er them roll. And in 1990, we see new light on the ancient mystery of Glastonbury. Here, John gives the historical context to the unfolding mystery of Glastonbury as a place of sanctity and myth. The cover is from the first edition with a watercolor by John. He's painted Glastonbury as a sacred island and an image of paradise. You see the Tor raising prominently on the horizon and Chalicewell just in front with a more rounded shape. The green Isle of Avalon floats in the Grail cup, its edge studded with jewels. I think here we don't see that part. A golden pink light suffuses the landscape, suggesting the golden age. Flames floating in the sky suggest the spirits guiding the early nomadic people, and a rainbow arches over all. The map on the left shows the 7 sacred hills of Glastonbury, which were formerly islands when the region was a marsh. John suggests that their positions match the star pattern of the constellation of Ursa Major, the Great Bear. But this match is a symbol, not a precise chart of the heavens. On the right is Bly Bond. John calls him an earnest philosopher in the mystical Platonic tradition. In 1918, Bond gave the results of his psychic archaeology in his book, The Gate of Remembrance. This was a spiritual magnet that attracted a community of mystics to Glastonbury. The Cereologist, sometimes spelled with an O and sometimes with an A, was a magazine on the crop circle phenomenon, edited for 3 years by John. On the top left, you see the very first issue from summer 1990 with the headline, New Wonders in the Cornfields. The yellow issue shows the insectograms near Stonehenge. The green cover, upper right, of 1992, shows some of the entries in the crop circle making competition. This was conceived by Rupert Sheldrake and organized by the Cereologist. The competition showed that it was easier to create a convincing crop circle than many had previously believed, but the phenomenon did not die out, as we shall see. 12 Tribe Nations and the Science of Enchanting the Landscape came out in 1991. This was the result of collaboration between John and me. The second edition appeared in 2008 with Inner Traditions with a new subtitle. Again, starting with Plato, in the Laws, he gives the pattern for an ideal 12-tribe constitution. This pattern was a reflection of heaven on earth. Traditions of nations divided into 12 tribes survive in many parts of the world from antiquity all the way to the 19th century. The most well-known are the 12 tribes of Israel under King Solomon, but there have been many others. Such societies existed in Iceland and Madagascar, Europe, the ancient East, and America. Top right is a sketch map of Madagascar. The circle, the central circle around the capital Antananarivo, shows the district of Imarina. There, the tradition of a 12-tribe nation survived until the late 19th century. In the 1940s, anthropologist Mary Danieli observed the similarity between the state systems of Imarina and Iceland. On the bottom right is a painting of the annual Assembly of Tribes in Iceland, where there was a tradition also of a 12-tribe nation. In these societies, each tribe corresponded to a sign of the zodiac. On the left, the diagram shows a 12-part division of Ireland. 1994, at the center of the world, polar symbolism discovered in Celtic, Norse, and other ritualized landscapes. The philosophical core of this book, again, is Plato. In the Laws, he says that the location of the state citadel must be as nearly as possible in the very center of the country. Plato does not say how to define the central spot or how to locate it, but a body of specialists within the priesthood always dealt with such questions. The sketch map upper right represents one seed of this book. One evening, I showed John how the city of Tel el Amarna, the city built by the pharaoh Akhenaten, is halfway between the northern and southern limits of ancient Egypt. John gave me a funny look and soon began to write. On the far left, you see how the Isle of Man, right in the center of the British Isles, lies on the north-south axis from Duncansby Head in Scotland to the Land's End in Cornwall. Far right, the big tree is one of the claimed centers of England, the Midland Oak at Lillington, Warwickshire. And now we're going to make a slight jump out of chronological order. The temple at Jerusalem, a revelation, is from the year 2000. It takes the last chapter of 12 tribe nations and develops it further. That chapter was about the pattern of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. John found this pattern repeated 6 times the actual size of the temple. Revealing it were the streets of the old quarter, archaeological evidence, and natural features like the rock of Golgotha. Geodetically, its dimensions represent a particular fraction of the Earth's mean radius. John offers this pattern as a metaphor for the unity of the three Abrahamic religions and for all human unity. For years, John had wanted to write a book on the Shakespeare authorship question, and he produced one in 1996. He presents all sides of the controversy very fairly, but does not propose to solve the mystery. The title of the book, Who Wrote Shakespeare, is a short question, like the title of Mark Twain's book, Is Shakespeare Dead? In an interview, John said that Twain was a brilliant writer and his book, by far the funniest and one of the shrewdest on the whole authorship question. Twain had decided to defend Francis Bacon as the true author in order to argue with his steamship master. He said that finally, the more I looked into it, the more I was convinced of it, and now it's a faith I'd die for. On the top left is Delia Bacon, the anti-Stratfordian that John wrote about in Eccentric Lives. Below her is Francis Bacon, one of the main candidates for the authorship. The table on the right gives an idea of how many candidates there are without counting the possible groups. John Michell said in the same interview, "In many subjects, I found that the orthodoxy of a subject is based on very little other than presumption. And it's the case here that the Stratfordians can't really defend their case. Something I noticed very early on in other controversy is that when authorities on a subject abuse their opponents instead of arguing with them, then that's a significant find. It means there really is a problem." In 2004, John teamed up with Robin Heath, a mathematician and engineer, to produce another collaborative book, The Measure of Albion, The Lost Science of Prehistoric Britain. This same book came out in the US under the title The Lost Science of Measuring the Earth. Besides breaking ground in geodesy, especially in Britain, this book puts forth some important findings in metrology. The sketch diagram to the right shows a discovery made by Robin Heath. In fact, I think he's probably just mentioned it, the Preseli triangle, or maybe not, he might have left that one out. This is the great Pythagorean triangles linking Stonehenge with the Preselis in Wales and Lundy Island. A triangle with similar proportions also exists at Stonehenge. The sketch diagram to the left shows a discovery made by John Michell, the Caesar's triangle. A passage in Julius Caesar's De Bello Gallico contains hints of a geomantic division of Britain. John decodes this in the diagram to the left, revealing a harmonics of 3, 7, and 11 in the proportions of the axis. As the 1990s progressed, the media lost interest in crop circles, but the phenomenon did not expire. In fact, some of the formations became even more amazing. In 2002, John wrote the pamphlet, The Face and the Message, What Do They Mean and Where Are They From? The cover shows part of the face pictogram enhanced with some watercolor work by John. He co-authored a short book, Crooked Soli, A Crop Circle Revelation, with Alan Brown in 2005. On the cover is the Crooked Soli crop circle done as a computer graphic. On the left is the face crop circle of 2001, made of isolated clumps of standing wheat, something like computer pixels. Middle bottom picture shows encoded information sent out in 1974 by SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which beamed this as a radio message to a particular star cluster. The middle top picture shows the apparent response decoded from the crop circle that appeared next to the face. To the far right is another extraordinary formation, the crooked Soli crop circle. It contains the numbers 7920 and 5040, part of the numerical canon that John studied for decades. This crop circle defines an equilateral triangle with two places called crooked Soli and straight Soli. Every winter, as the holiday season drew near, John would get together with graphic designer Richard Adams and design a booklet that they would send out instead of Christmas cards. He wanted to mark the season with something of an antidote to conventional holiday cheer. So he often chose melancholic or radical traditional themes. On the upper right is a short story by George Gissing, a writer that John admired. On the bottom right is the poem by Oliver Goldsmith, A Deserted Village. This is about the lost golden age of country life before the rise of industry and capitalism. On the bottom left is a Christmas booklet published after John died. Richard is continuing the tradition together with John's son, Jason Goodwin, who is a writer. John Michell wrote many pamphlets, especially in the 1970s. He wrote some very provocative ones, like The Hip Pocket Hitler and That Great Cock. Confessions of a Radical Traditionalist is a volume of essays selected and introduced by Jocelyn Godwin in 2005. The essays appeared in the Oldie magazine, to which John was a regular contributor. The cover painting is by Maxwell Armfield, who painted John in the early 70s. The sea in the background suggests the Cornish connection of some of John's early books. In one hand, he holds a ruler, and in his other hand rests on a megalith. John was long active as an anti-metricationist against the metric system, defending traditional units of measure which are based on geodesy. The essays are sometimes hilarious and cover many subjects. On the back cover of this volume is a watercolor painting by John of fivefold geometry, a colorful web of interlocking pentagons and pentagrams. The painting is reversible. The caption for the left side is, "Someone must have hit the right note because everything suddenly began falling into place." If we turn the painting upside down, we get another message, and the caption reads, "As we watched, the pattern started to fall apart, and soon a lifetime's work had become a total ruin." And here is John's last book, How the World is Made, the story of creation according to sacred geometry. From 2009, again in collaboration with Alan Brown. We've seen this cover picture before. As we know, John painted the heavenly city diagram countless times, and here in spectral sequence. Here John gives the story of creation according to the Timaeus of Plato and the biblical story of Genesis. The book is a sum of John's philosophy and contains many of his watercolors. He dedicated it to master geometer Keith Critchlow, whom he calls our modern Pythagoras. And this is a painting from the back cover. The octagon, eight-sided figure, often appears in architecture as a bridge between the circle and the square, or heaven and earth. And here it represents a human settlement. John's caption reads, "Our ancient forefathers, God rest their bones, cut down the trees and cleared the land of stones. Then, having drawn a square with its diagonal, used it to make our settlement octagonal. We're rather isolated in these woods, but do not need to purchase many goods, for at the base our ancestors decided that we should live on what our lands provided." And here is John in a cafe on Portobello Road in West London, autumn 2007, holding the manuscript for How the World is Made. Sadly, he did not live to see the book published and regretted the delay in publication. And so to fill a gap, to try and bridge that final absence that the Grim Reaper drops among the living, I've made up a little story, and it goes like this. Not gone, just temporarily dematerialized. In this picture, in the background, right next to John is the Rosette Nebula, a star-forming cloud. It symbolizes his ability to inspire and to catalyze. On the upper right is the Eagle Nebula. That symbolizes John's qualities as a visionary. The red nebula that looks like a flower is the Cat's Eye Nebula. It represents John's sense of beauty and keen intelligence. It features unusual, shock-induced knots of gases. Those are for John's trickster qualities, switching things around, reversing received ideas, forever turning the tables to reveal the unexpected. Up, okay, I thought we were going to have another slide of Megalithomania, but it seems to have vanished. Anyway, about a year after John Michell had temporarily dematerialized, I was asked by the Temenos Academy to lead a study day in his memory. The Temenos Academy is an educational charity co-founded by the poet Christine Rhone, geometer architect Keith Critchlow, and one or two others. Their focus is on the perennial philosophy and the divine imagination or cosmic anamnesis. John's heavenly city diagram fits in with this focus as a symbol of the unity of being and the cosmos. Temenos offers courses, lecture series, study days, and publishes an annual journal. The first John Michell study day went very well, and so I have followed it up every so often, not every year by any means, with another study day. The influence of his work has been important over the years. I would like to express much gratitude and appreciation to Hugh Newman and all his crew for sponsoring the John Michell Memorial Lecture every year at the Megalithomania Conference here in Glastonbury, a place that is so deeply connected with the best of John's spirit and vision. Thank you all.